Yeah, can you believe that in the early 2000s, this phone, if you used too many minutes on your phone calls, you had to wait till after 9 p.m. often to be able to make calls to your friends and family. Ugh, what a crazy time. Oh man, my GitHub Copilot token usage exceeded. Now I gotta wait till next month. Anyways, let me show you how to use AI with Power Query that doesn't involve GitHub Copilot. All right, as always, don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel so you can stay up to date on all the new content and features we'll be rolling out in the coming weeks. And with that, just because the Copilot licensing has changed doesn't mean that it's the only option for us when we're building or using AI with our Power BI or even Fabric solutions. And in today's video, I want to introduce you to a technique that we've been using in Azure Foundry with Dataflows that makes it easier to do data quality checks and cleanup of data. So I want to show you that, illustrate an example that probably many of you have dealt with before. So up on the screen here, I've got a Gen1 Dataflow, and I know many of you are still using Gen1 Dataflows, especially those that are working in sovereign tenants. This is the only option for you. And often we are given data that would need a cleanup. And in this case, I've got some city, let me go and zoom in here. I've got some city data that has a bunch of different ways of spelling. Let's say Fort Worth, San Antonio doesn't have a space in it. Washington, D.C. maybe doesn't have dots for an acronym. We're using Oklahoma City, we're shorthand for the abbreviation. This is all kind of very common stuff that maybe we're dealing with upstream data, maybe a Power App saving data to a SharePoint list, and we have to clean up this data. Now, historically, this has been very difficult because what you would normally have to do is have a bunch of copy and replaces or introduce maybe fuzzy matching to make the changes, or make the changes locally using a technique from this book that uses the HTML and JavaScript's regex expression to make that change. But fundamentally, the problem with that we're faced with is Power Query lacks a regex engine. So how do we get around that? Well, with the advent of artificial intelligence and large language models, we can actually use large language models within our Power Query to clean up this data and not have an extensive find and replace and a lot of steps that ultimately will only cover the known issues and not necessarily the new ones as they crop up. So what does that look like in detail? Well, first, if you're doing this in Gen 1, you're going to have to create an Azure Foundry project, which is available both in public and in sovereign tenants. So here I've already created a Microsoft Foundry project. And when you do that, you don't necessarily get all the models initially. You have to deploy models. And you can select a model here by clicking deploy. And depending on where you're doing this, whether you're in commercial or sovereign tenants, you might have different options and different versions available to you. Now, for the purpose of this demo, I've already created a model. I've just selected one, and I'm going to pick one that I know is going to get archived here relatively shortly, but I want to show you the power of you don't need to use the latest model or the most expensive model to do this. So if you're looking to save on money, keep an eye on this and test out other models. So I'm using GPT-4o. And once you create that model, what you can do is set up a playground. And I'm going to click over here just to illustrate playground session I already have set up. Now, I have been working on a prompt that tells the large language model that, hey, you're going to be faced with a bunch of different spellings on cities. And we know you've probably been trained on a lot of data about how cities are spelt. So this is the kind of the constraints you're going to operate in, and this is the output I want you to have. Now, in this case, I've got this prompt here using pseudolang, which I have in another video, kind of go into what pseudolang is, that lays out kind of from a code perspective what your constraints on, the input, what you're expecting, like abbreviations, acronyms. What I want you to do is correct the spellings or merge words. And then I give you a bunch of different output examples to work with. So in the case of Saint or Fort, I want you to spell the whole word out. In the case of acronyms, I want you to spell the whole city name out. And then always, it's good practice to tell large language models what to do, but also not what to do. And then finally, tell it, hey, I don't need explanations, just give me the name. And in this case, I have a little input field here where I put the word St. Louis, and you can see the output is St. Louis with the word Saint spelled out. Now, this prompt, you can use this playground to test out the different scenarios. And then once you're comfortable with that prompt, you can bring that into a Gen1 Dataflow. Now, I have an example of what the Power Query code looks like in a gist at the YouTube description, but let me walk you through this. One note is I definitely always recommend, if you're doing this in Gen1, to have this with a development flag, because every time you make that call to the Azure Foundry service, you're putting money in the Microsoft's piggy bank. So I want to maybe reduce the number of calls to start with, just so that I can make sure that it's doing it correctly. And then I have a set of parameters that identify the Foundry URL, which is available when you go to the model, you can see that here, and then the key. Now, this is an important caveat here. When you're working in Gen1, that key is going to get stored in plain text in the data flow. There's no way around it. I don't see any areas for improvement in Gen1 Dataflows, considering its legacy. But if you have to use this, consider recycling the keys often and making sure that that data flow is restricted in that workspace to just the team who has access to this, and that avoids exposure. I would not put this Power Query code in a semantic model that somebody can download and then seize your key. But we got to manage with what we can work with. We can put mitigating circumstances around protecting the key by recycling it often and making sure that the data flow is housed in a workspace with restricted access. Now, you've got that caveat out of the way. Let's go back. I've got those two in here, and then I have a function that calls Azure Foundry. You can see that it's calling the model GPO. You can change this in the source code on whatever model you want to choose. And what it does is it's going to call the API with the prompt, and that's the token that you can see here that gets passed. Now, keep in mind that web.contents in Power Query has to use an anonymous connection when it's making a post request. I wish that was different. We could have maybe some other options for authentication if that wasn't the case, but that's why we got to pass the key in the header to send that post request. Now, when this goes across the wire, the way I've set this up is that's kind of the wrapper function to call the Azure Foundry service, but then we've got the cleanup input here, which all it does is it's taking the prompt template, changing the input tag, which I've kind of put as a placeholder with the name of the city, and then calling the Azure Foundry prompt. And that is stored in here. So the same prompt I showed you in the playground in which you're running the test, this is what's getting swapped out at the bottom So you can use this again and again. Now, also keep in mind that often what you can do is you can minimize this prompt too once you're ready for production to reduce the number of tokens that's doing. So you can kind of minimize it, reduce some of the examples, and that could help you reduce the number of tokens that are going over the wire, both in network traffic and in cost for the large language model. Now, when this operates, the way that this works is, let's say I've got this source data. I've got the development flag on, so it's just going to do the first 5 rows. And then I'm going to have a function that passes in the city. And that's what's going to call the Azure Foundry service. And then you can see here what the output is. So it's cleaned that up. Now, if I jump over, let's say I save this as a Gen1 Dataflow. This just gives you an example. I've connected a report to the data flow, and you can see now the data has been cleaned up. So it's probably the most, let's see, Virginia Beach, you can see here. You can see that Fort Worth, Fort Lauderdale has been cleaned up. And then you can iterate off of this. And what's nice about that is that you can continue to update the prompt to clean up the data and then build your test cases in the playground to work with this. And this is a nice workaround in Gen 1 to add in what would normally be a regex expression, but we can't do that in Power Query, get close to what a regex expression can do. Now, in Gen 2, this is much easier if you're running on a non-trial capacity in Fabric. And let me show you what that is. So I've got the same data set, or the same source data, and I want to run the same prompt. Well, all you have to do is use a function called AI prompt column. Now, again, you can't do this in a trial capacity. You're going to have to do this in a Fabric paid capacity. And so when you click on that button, it's going to give you an option. Let me go to the configure here. And you can give it what the column name. So this is just like add custom column. And then you can enter your prompt. And in this case, what I've done is swapped out input by selecting city. So at this point, then the prompt kind of knows, hey, here is the selected columns for context. I'm going to pass in the city to that prompt. And then you can see very similar output that we had with the Gen1 Dataflow. And the nice thing about this, at least in Gen 2, is this is just using a Fabric connection. So we didn't have to put a key in plain text, worry about protecting the data flow. This is all kind of built in. And then you can iterate off of this without having that external dependency for Foundry. This is great if you have access to Fabric. If you don't have access to Fabric or you're in a sovereign tenant, Azure Foundry is the way to go, especially since Azure Foundry can also deal with some of the data residency issues that you're going to have in those sovereign tenants. So this is a very compelling use of large language models without doing the agentic approach, but we're still leveraging AI to do the work. And this is definitely something I would consider when you're having to look at doing regex expressions at Power Query and you don't necessarily have another option, or you're not comfortable with other tool sets like Python or JavaScript. All right, so I hope you learned something today. We covered how to use Azure Foundry to do what would be considered regex expressions and cleanup of data in Gen1 Dataflows, but I also showed you kind of the easy button way to do it in Gen2 Dataflows. Now, in upcoming videos, we're going to go over other techniques using AI, not necessarily just around agentic. We'll cover agentic, but want to show you there is different tools and there's continued investment in different tooling that you can bring in AI so that you can become an AI-enabled Power BI developer. But until next time, take care.